After the long and hard-fought battle during the American Revolution, thousands of Loyalists were in search of refuge. These Loyalists were Americans that supported the Crown. These people ended up going to Quebec and living under the Quebec Act. In Quebec, there were two groups of people, the French and the English. These two groups were living in a society based on accommodation. Even with two different cultures, they lived together as one. They lived under the Quebec Act, but many of the new Loyalists that arrived did not accept the French privileges and rights that seemed to clash against British culture. Some of the aspects that angered the Loyalists included the seigneurial system, French civil law, and Catholicism. They felt as if the province of Quebec was run more like a French colony rather than an English colony. In the province, the English had the most power, but the French made up the majority of the population. The British were faced with a dilemma. A single assembly for the whole colony wouldn't work for the English settlers because the French had the majority. And while the British had to create the appearance of an assembly, they didn't really want to give it much power because they knew from the American Revolution what that would lead to. In order to satisfy the English without angering the French, a new constitution was introduced.
In addition to two new colonies, New Brunswick and Cape Breton Island, the massive migration of Loyalists to the British North America led to the creation of a third colony in 1791, Upper Canada, which emerged from the division of the province of Quebec into two separate colonies. This division was made official by the Constitutional Act of 1791, which recognized the creation of Upper Canada in the western portion of the province and Lower Canada in the eastern portion. The two parts were split by the Ottawa River. Keep in mind that by this time, relationships between the English speakers in the west and the French speakers in the east were strained to the breaking point, and this partition was the only hope for the British government of restraining the dedication of its Loyalist subjects in Quebec.
Upper and Lower Canada both had very similar forms of government. The population that was able to vote had to be male landowners. The only people that landowners could vote for was the Legislative Assembly. The Legislative Assembly that gets elected was made up of the people's representatives. They imposed taxes and could make laws to serve local needs. The Legislative Assembly had little real power because the governor, Legislative Council, and Executive Council could veto their laws. The Legislative Council wasn't voted for, but appointed by people who held more power. Their job was to advise the governor and was able to propose new laws. These people were appointed for life, but were maintained as long as the governor chose to keep them on the council. The next power was the lieutenant governor, whose job was to carry out the wishes of the British government. He was very powerful. The governor himself was appointed by the British Parliament. Finally, the King of England held the most power in decision-making. The Constitutional Act came into effect on December 26, 1791, just a few years after the creation of the provinces of New Brunswick and Cape Breton. The western half became Upper Canada and the eastern half became Lower Canada. The Constitution ended during 1837, when both colonies rebelled against the Crown. Lower Canada demanded control over the ways revenue in the colony were spent. They also feared the growing numbers of English people. Protests led to violence and inspired radicals in Upper Canada to take their own action against the Crown, but was much smaller and less deadly.
Economic consequences. The Act stated that 1/7 of all land would be used as clergy reserves in Upper Canada. As expected, many Protestants ended up using the land. These clergy reserves were land set aside for the Protestant clergy, yet it was perceived to be land for the Church of England. The land gained no money, as people used it for its resources and left once they were gone. social. The friends and relatives of governors controlled the executive. These were people who often served their own interest. Because they were in relation to the governors, they usually had similar ideologies and mindsets, so the government did not vary. This was basically a corruption and it was a big issue in the government. In Lower Canada, the Château clique was a group of wealthy families and belonged to Reform, and in Upper Canada, the Family Compact, which was the epithet applied by their opponents to a small, close group of men who exercised most of the political, economic, and judicial power, were blamed for many financial scandals. Political. The act stated that persons which were men's 21 years old or older with no criminal record and had land ownership / rented property were given the right to vote. The government stated that in order to vote, you had to own land / rent property of a certain monetary value. This number was set low on purpose in order to have broad representation of the populace. Voting did increase as more had the right. Because women were not specifically excluded in the act, women property in Lower Canada were given the right to vote. This is because in Lower Canada, inheritance rights were determined under French law, which allowed women to receive half of her husband's property after his death. Women in Upper Canada, however, were unable to vote because of English common law did not grant them property. This only added more tension between Upper and Lower Canada, since people felt unjustly treated.
The French outnumbered the English in Quebec by a majority, which led the province of Quebec to be under the Quebec Act. After the American Revolution, this majority shifted as 10,000 Loyalists that came from the American colonies sought refuge in Quebec. The Loyalists were unhappy living under the French law and the Roman Catholic Church. They wanted to hold their lands outright and not part of the seigneurial system, and they wanted privileges for their Protestant church similar to those granted to Roman Catholics. Also, they were used to having democratic institutions like an elected assembly to give them a say on how they were governed. The British answer was to divide the colony into two parts, Upper Canada for the English and Lower Canada for the French, and give each its own assembly, but in such a way that the British governor and his appointed council still made the final decisions about most things. This was a compromise full of problems. The Constitutional Act was impacted by the Quebec Act of 1774 on the list of events talked about in class, but was also impacted by the American Revolution, which was not covered in class. The Quebec Act gave the French Canadians religious freedom and restored French civil law. The American Revolution plays a role in which the Loyalists from America took refuge in Quebec. This resulted in an increase of English-speaking population in Quebec. This led to the Loyalists not wanting to live under the Quebec Act anymore. This led to the desire for representative institutions and for English common law, which was the act that was eventually passed by the British Parliament. The split of Quebec happened and resulted in Upper and Lower Canada. The English province would have English common law and an assembly. The French province might have been left with the forms of government provided by the Quebec Act. Economically, England demanded timber to build British warships for the War of 1812. England turned to Canada as there were a vast supply of lumber. The fur trade went into steep decline in 1770. Over 75% of Quebec's exports to Great Britain were furs. By 1810, furs accounted for only 9% of the exports of Upper and Lower Canada. Timber helped by the superior British tariffs accounted for over 70% of the exports to Great Britain. Canals were built to improve transport and trade between Upper and Lower Canada. Agriculture declined mostly in wheat production in Lower Canada in 1830. It was unable to meet foreign demand and began to import wheat because of their poor harvest, outdated methods, and soil depletion. Overcrowded seigneurs made the situation worse.
Socially, they believed this could satisfy the demands of both the Loyalists and the French Canadians. The Constitutional Act was intended to persuade the French Canadians of the superiority of the British institutions and assimilate them into British culture. The act had an opposite effect. 1800s to 1850, French Canadians saw the immigrants as a threat since they brought disease, competed for job, and increased English population of Lower Canada. There were many political effects the Constitutional Act had that affected the structure of government. With mounting tensions in both Upper and Lower Canada, the Constitutional Act reinforced a structure of government that assured the continued domination by the leaders of society, which were wealthy merchants, the Church of England, and the British appointed members of government. This structure gave local decision-makers a formal arena to discuss how they would like to govern, but denied them this power to ensure the implementation of their objectives. The assemblies of both provinces controlled taxation, but the governors had access to crown revenues and military budget that allowed them to spend without consulting the assemblies and govern with impunity. The results of this were growing hostilities between the assemblies, colonial officials, and governors. This soon led to the corruption of the Constitution.
At the time, the main point for the Constitution was to satisfy both the French majority and the English Loyalists. However, many of the issues that existed prior to the Constitutional Act began to affect both Upper Canada and Lower Canada yet again. Some issues like language and religion was still an issue in Lower Canada as the English population started to grow in the colony. This only increased conflict and tension between the two groups by reminding them about their differences. The variation in governance lent inequalities, which ultimately led to conflict when one side felt as though they were being treated unfairly. This division did not satisfy the French. They saw the English and the Protestants as a threat to their religion, which was Catholicism, and when the English gained more power in Canada, the French's fears increased. The English held more political and economic dominance than the French, and for that, the French wanted reform. Upper Canada was frustrated with Lower Canada for its demands. This conflict eventually fueled the rebellions of 1837 and has contributed to the divide between French and English Canada that exists today, as Quebec still has its own political party, Bloc Québécois, and has threatened to split from Canada. Furthermore, the Act would have consequences on the development of modern-day Canada by establishing two different provinces like Ontario and Quebec. Today, the Act would serve as a symbol in many ways as well. Throughout Canada today, there are institutions where reference of Upper or Lower Canada still exist. For one, there are schools in Canada called Upper Canada College in Ontario and Lower Canada College in Quebec. In the exact places where Upper and Lower Canada once existed, reference to these institutions helps show how the Act indirectly exists in symbolic forms in places in Canada, and symbolically show how Canada has been shaped through the ages. Also, another impact the Constitutional Act of 1791 had on Canada was that it was a start to Canadian Confederation. By creating a constitution and caring about Canada, Britain took their first stride to creating Canada. This is something significant to present day because if this act had not existed, then this country may not even exist to this day. The division was significant in 1791 because it resolved issues between the French and British. It resolved issues by separating the two groups while creating a province for each other. It was the best of both worlds for the two groups. Furthermore, another significance the Act had on today is that it gave equal rights to all races and genders across Canada. The act only stated that you had to be a landowner 21 and older with little criminal activity to vote. The act said nothing about any race or sex to be restricted to vote. This is significant because this took place in a very unequal age. This was the start to the end of racism and gender inequality. The Constitutional Act of 1791 is definitely significant, for it shaped Canada in many ways that the average Canadian would not know, through its notability, widespread consequences, and symbolism. In conclusion, the Constitutional Act of 1791 was a British law which changed the government of the province of Quebec to accommodate the many English-speaking settlers who had arrived from the United States following the American Revolution. Quebec was divided into two. The western half became Upper Canada, which is now southern Ontario, and the eastern half Lower Canada, which is now southern Quebec. Upper Canada received English law and institutions, while Lower Canada retained their French law and institutions. The act was problematic for both English and French. The French felt they might be overshadowed by English settlement and increased rights for Protestants, while the new English settlers felt the French still had too much power. However, both English and French preferred the act and institutions it created to American rule.
I've been down so long it look like up to me. They look up.